Sarah stood before Judge Caprio, a small figure in a beige coat, her shoulders shaking slightly. Her face was blotchy, tears tracing paths through the faint powder she'd likely applied that morning, trying to look presentable for court. Her hands, gnarled with age, clutched a crumpled tissue. She tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. The microphone in front of her seemed to amplify the silence in the courtroom, making her struggle even more apparent. Finally, a choked whisper escaped. "It was just a few minutes, Your Honor. I swear." Judge Caprio, known for his calm demeanor, leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady on Sarah. He listened, his expression unreadable, as the court clerk, a young woman with a crisp uniform and an even crisper tone, read out the details of the parking violation. The clerk's voice was efficient, devoid of emotion, listing the street, the time, the exact nature of the infraction. It was just a number, a code, another case to be processed. For Sarah, though, it was much more. It was a weight, heavy and suffocating. She managed to explain, her words coming out in gasps between sobs, that she had been rushing to the pharmacy. Her medication, she said, was vital, and she'd misjudged the time on the meter. The fine, she added, was more than she could really afford right now. The way she said it, "More than I can really afford," wasn't just about the dollar amount. It hinted at a deeper struggle, a quiet battle, fought daily, far from the polished halls of justice. It was a glimpse into a life where every penny counted, where a simple parking ticket wasn't an inconvenience but a significant setback. A quiet murmur rippled through the courtroom. Heads turned, whispers exchanged. It wasn't a loud noise, just a soft shift in the atmosphere, a collective intake of breath. Then Sarah looked up, her eyes pleading, not just with the judge, but with the entire system represented by the room. Her voice cracked, clearer this time, carrying a surprising strength. "Some laws forget the heart behind the hardship." The words hung in the air, simple yet profound. The judge, who had been listening patiently, now leaned even further forward. His brow furrowed slightly, a flicker of something crossing his face. Perhaps thought, perhaps concern. He looked from Sarah to the court clerk, then back to Sarah. The courtroom fell into a deeper silence, everyone waiting. What would he do? Would he uphold the rigid rules, the impersonal system that the clerk represented? Or would he see the person, the hardship, the heart Sarah spoke of? The tension was thick, almost tangible. The outcome was completely uncertain. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Sarah's life had always been rooted in the quiet, working-class neighborhood of Providence, Rhode Island. It was a place where generations knew each other, where the corner store owner still asked about your mother, and where a good day meant seeing neighbors tending their small, neat gardens. Her home, a modest 2-bedroom house, was always meticulously kept, a testament to her belief in order and hard work. The scent of lemon polish often lingered in the air, a familiar comfort. Every morning, she'd walk to the local grocery, exchanging pleasantries with Mrs. Henderson, who had owned the place since Sarah was a girl. The rhythm of her days was predictable, built on small routines and familiar faces, a life centered around community and a deep-seated frugality. Her generation valued independence above all else. You didn't ask for help unless it was absolutely necessary, and even then, you felt a pang of guilt. Her family, though scattered now, carried the same stoic expectation. Her brother, a retired mechanic living 2 states away, would often say during their infrequent phone calls, "You make do with what you got, Sarah." It wasn't unkindness, just a reflection of their upbringing, a silent code of self-reliance. This upbringing had served her well for decades, through lean times and good, through raising her children and seeing them off into their own lives. But the world around her had changed. The small personal interactions that defined her community were slowly being replaced by something bigger, colder, and much less human. This impersonal bureaucratic system, with its endless forms, confusing websites, and rigid rules, was becoming an increasingly pervasive force. Parking regulations, court procedures, utility bills that arrived with barely comprehensible charges. These were the new antagonists in her life. They were unyielding, unforgiving, a stark contrast to the personal, community-oriented life she had always known. It wasn't a sudden shift. It was gradual, like the slow creep of rust on an old car. First, it was the automated phone systems that never quite understood her simple questions. Then, the increasing cost of everything, from groceries to her medications, chipping away at her fixed income. She remembered once trying to dispute a small charge on her water bill, spending an entire afternoon on hold, only to be told she needed to fill out a form online, something she wasn't comfortable doing. Each small encounter left her feeling a little more isolated, a little more out of place in a world that seemed to be moving too fast for her. The subtle hints of her growing isolation became more pronounced as she aged. Simple tasks, like renewing her car registration, turned into daunting expeditions involving multiple offices and confusing instructions. The local bank branch, where she knew everyone, closed down, replaced by an ATM and a call center. She felt like a small boat trying to navigate a vast, indifferent ocean. These were tiny cracks, almost invisible to an outsider. But to Sarah they were a growing chasm. They foreshadowed the larger struggle, the one that would eventually bring her, tearful and vulnerable, before Judge Caprio. The parking ticket was not the start of her troubles, but merely the visible tip of an iceberg, a culmination of years spent quietly battling a system that had no room for the heart behind the hardship. The cracks that had been forming in Sarah's life, almost imperceptibly at first, began to widen and deepen. Her financial stability, once a solid foundation built on decades of careful saving and diligent budgeting, started to erode. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but a slow, grinding process, like water wearing down stone. She'd always been proud of her ability to manage, to make every dollar stretch. But now, the numbers just didn't add up anymore. She remembered the humiliation of having to choose between a new prescription for her arthritis pain and fixing a leaky faucet. The faucet dripped for weeks, a constant, annoying reminder of her dwindling resources. Then there was the winter, when the gas bill spiked unexpectedly. She kept the thermostat lower than she ever had, bundling up in extra sweaters, feeling the chill seep into her bones. Not just from the cold outside, but from a deeper, colder fear inside. Each small struggle chipped away at her fierce independence, forcing her to confront a vulnerability she had always tried to hide. There were times she reached out, quietly, subtly, for help. She'd mentioned her struggles to a distant niece, hoping for a sympathetic ear, perhaps even some practical advice. The niece, busy with her own young family, had listened politely, offered a few vague suggestions about looking into government programs, and then quickly changed the subject to her children's achievements. Sarah understood the niece meant well, but the dismissal stung. It wasn't just the lack of help, but the feeling of being overlooked, of her problems seeming insignificant in the grand scheme of someone else's life. These instances, though seemingly minor, compounded her sense of isolation and made her less likely to reach out again. She learned to keep her struggles to herself, to suffer in silence rather than face another gentle rebuff. The bureaucratic systems, which had once felt merely impersonal, now seemed almost abusive in their indifference. Each interaction chipped away at her dignity. A call to the utility company about a confusing charge led to an automated menu that offered no relevant options, followed by a long wait only to be disconnected. Another time, trying to renew a benefit, she was told she needed a document she'd never even heard of, requiring another trip across town on 2 different buses, only to find the office closed for lunch. Each hurdle, each minor inconvenience, felt like a deliberate attempt to make her feel small, unheard, and irrelevant. The system wasn't actively trying to hurt her, but its sheer lack of human consideration had the same effect. It was a constant, low-level assault on her spirit. These cumulative experiences left an emotional weariness that settled deep within her. The parking fine, when it arrived, wasn't just another bill. It was the final straw, a physical manifestation of all the invisible pressures that had been building up for years. It was the unexpected utility bills, the unaffordable medications, the well-meaning but busy relatives, the endless automated phone menus, the closed offices, the confusing forms. It was the sum of 1,000 tiny cuts, each one eroding her resilience. When she stood before Judge Caprio, tears streaming down her face, it wasn't just about the parking ticket. It was about everything that had led up to that moment. A lifetime of quiet struggles, culminating in a public display of distress that she could no longer hold back. The fine was simply the last weight on an already overburdened soul. The financial tension around Sarah tightened like a knot. Every morning, she woke with a low hum of anxiety in her stomach, a constant reminder of the thin ice she walked on. Her income was fixed, barely covering the basics, and any unexpected expense felt like a punch to the gut. She had started a daily ritual of going through her bills, not to pay them, but to strategize, to figure out which one could wait just a little longer. It was a grim game of financial whack-a-mole, where every time she put out one fire, another flared up. Her daily compromises became more and more stark. The fresh produce she once enjoyed was replaced by cheaper, less nutritious canned goods. She'd stand in the grocery aisle, comparing prices, calculating ounces per penny, the joy of cooking long gone, replaced by a cold, hard arithmetic. Medication, essential for her high blood pressure, became another line item to scrutinize. Sometimes she'd split pills, making them last longer, knowing it wasn't right, but seeing no other choice. The fear of overdue bills was a constant companion. She learned the exact dates when the disconnect notices would arrive, the precise number of days she had before the lights might go out or the water stopped running. Each envelope, from a utility company or a medical provider, felt heavier than the last, carrying with it the weight of her dwindling independence. Neighbors, some of whom had known her for decades, started to notice. Not everyone, but a few would offer a pitying look, a hushed comment about how things must be tough for Sarah. She hated it. She cherished her privacy, her dignity. These silent judgments, however well-intentioned, felt like an invasion, another layer of burden. Distant family members, when they called, would often offer advice that was completely out of touch with her reality. "Have you tried cutting back on coffee?" one grandniece suggested cheerfully. Sarah hadn't bought coffee in months. "There are programs for seniors, you know," another said, as if she hadn't spent countless hours navigating those very programs, only to hit dead ends. Their words, meant to help, often just highlighted the vast chasm between their comfortable lives and her daily struggle. The environment around her seemed to mirror her internal turmoil. That summer was especially brutal, the heat oppressive and relentless. Her old air conditioner struggled, humming loudly but doing little to cool the small rooms. The constant whirring became a soundtrack to her worries. The relentless ticking of the old grandfather clock in her living room, a family heirloom, used to be a comforting sound. Now, each tick felt like time slipping away, pushing her closer to another bill due, another decision to make. Sometimes she would hear the distant wail of a siren, a sudden sharp sound cutting through the quiet, and for a moment, her heart would race. It was a reminder of the unpredictable world outside, a world that felt increasingly hostile and uncaring. These small, sensory details amplified her feeling of being overwhelmed, of being trapped in a situation she couldn't escape. Sarah was near her breaking point. Her spirit, once so resilient, was worn thin. The constant worry had etched lines deeper into her face, and her eyes held a weariness that went beyond simple fatigue. She felt invisible, unheard, and utterly alone. The weight of her circumstances was crushing her, slowly, relentlessly, pushing her to the very edge of emotional collapse. She knew she couldn't keep going like this, but she had no idea what else to do. Every path she saw felt blocked, every door closed. She was adrift, and the parking fine was about to prove just how far she had drifted. The parking ticket, when it finally appeared on her windshield, wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a physical manifestation of everything she had lost control over. It was the universe telling her, in no uncertain terms, that even the smallest, most mundane aspects of her life were now subject to external forces she couldn't manage. She remembered the day clearly. It was a Tuesday, typically her grocery day, but her neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, had fallen and needed a ride to the doctor. Sarah, always one to help, didn't think twice. Mrs. Henderson's appointment was across town in an area Sarah rarely visited, known for its tricky parking. She had circled the block 3 times, her old car sputtering, before spotting a seemingly empty spot. There was a faded sign, mostly obscured by an overgrown bush, and in her rush, her mind already on Mrs. Henderson's pain, she hadn't given it a second glance. She helped Mrs. Henderson out of the car, slowly, carefully, her own arthritis flaring with the effort. When they returned an hour later, the bright orange envelope stood out starkly against the dusty glass. Her heart sank. It felt like a punch to the gut. Not because of the amount, though that was significant, but because it was yet another thing she couldn't afford, another problem she hadn't foreseen. Her first attempt to resolve it was by phone. She spent what felt like an eternity, navigating automated menus, pressing numbers, listening to hold music. When she finally reached a human, the voice on the other end was clipped, impersonal. "The sign is clearly posted, ma'am. There's no appeal for this type of violation." Sarah tried to explain about Mrs. Henderson, about the obscured sign, about her financial situation. The woman simply repeated the regulations, her tone unyielding. It was like talking to a wall. Each word from the anonymous voice chipped away at Sarah's remaining patience, her sense of dignity. She felt dismissed, unheard. Just another number in a system that didn't care about individual stories. She called again the next day, hoping for a different outcome, a different person. The result was the same. The fine stood. The late fees would start accumulating soon. It was then, standing in her quiet kitchen, the phone heavy in her hand, that a quiet anger began to simmer. She had always been a private person, someone who dealt with her problems alone. But this felt different. This felt like an injustice, a final, unnecessary burden placed upon her. She had tried to be responsible, to follow the rules, to help others, and for that she was being punished. The decision to appear before Judge Caprio wasn't made lightly. It was born out of a mix of desperation and a stubborn refusal to be ignored. She had seen him on TV, heard stories of his compassion. Part of her felt silly, a small old woman going to court over a parking ticket. But another stronger part of her knew she couldn't just pay it and let it go. It was more than the money. It was the principle. It was a final, defiant act of seeking understanding in a world that had become increasingly cold and unfeeling. It was her breaking free from the silent suffering she had endured for so long. This wasn't about winning or losing the case. It was about standing up for herself, for her story. It was about confronting the system directly, face to face, instead of letting it chip away at her from the shadows. Despite her vulnerability, the decision felt like a profound act of courage. It was her ingrained independence, something she hadn't realized she still possessed, pushing her forward. She would go, she would speak her truth, and whatever happened, she would know she had tried. The courtroom remained hushed, the last echoes of Sarah's trembling voice hanging in the air. Heads bowed, some dabbed at their eyes, and a few exchanged empathetic glances. The court officers, usually stoic and detached, shifted slightly, a subtle nod of understanding passing between them. Judge Caprio, who had listened without interruption, now leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on Sarah. His expression, which had been unreadable moments before, softened. There was no trace of judgment, only a deep, quiet consideration. He cleared his throat, the small sound loud in the silence. "Mrs. Davies," he began, his voice calm and measured. "I hear you. I truly do." He paused, letting his words sink in. "This isn't just about a parking ticket, is it? It's about feeling invisible. It's about a lifetime of trying to do the right thing, and then feeling like the world keeps throwing obstacles in your way." He looked around the courtroom, making eye contact with a few people in the gallery. We forget sometimes, in these halls, that laws are made for people, not the other way around, and people have stories. He then turned back to Sarah, a gentle smile touching his lips. "The fine is dismissed, Mrs. Davies, completely, and not just that." He reached for a small pad of paper, scribbling something quickly. "I want you to take this to the clerk's office downstairs. It's a voucher for a month's worth of groceries on me. Consider it a small token, not just for your time today, but for reminding us all what truly matters." A collective sigh seemed to ripple through the room. Sarah, still wiping tears from her eyes, looked up, a mixture of disbelief and profound relief washing over her face. She tried to speak, but only a choked sob escaped. The judge simply nodded, understanding. The impersonal legal system, which had felt so cold and unyielding, transformed in that moment. It wasn't just about a dismissal. It was about recognition, about validation. Sarah wasn't just a number. She was seen, she was heard, and her struggles were acknowledged, not dismissed. It was an emotional victory, a restoration of her dignity that transcended the small sum of the fine. As she slowly made her way out of the courtroom, the weight that had pressed down on her for so long began to lift. The air felt lighter. The sunlight streaming through the courthouse windows seemed brighter. People she passed offered small, kind smiles, some even a quiet, "God bless you." She clutched the voucher in her hand, not just for the food it represented, but for the unexpected kindness it embodied. Walking down the courthouse steps, Sarah felt a profound sense of reconnection to humanity. The world, which had felt so isolating and indifferent, had shown her a moment of unexpected grace. She thought about Mrs. Henderson, about the obscured sign, about all the small indignities and struggles that had led her to this moment. And she realized that even in moments of extreme vulnerability, there was a quiet dignity to be found. Her spirit, worn thin by worry, felt a flicker of hope rekindle. She reflected on the power of empathy, on how one person's genuine understanding could cut through layers of bureaucracy and impersonal rules. It wasn't just about the fine being dismissed. It was about feeling less alone. She hadn't expected such a response, such a human touch from the system. It left her with a lasting impression of hope, of the quiet resilience of the human spirit, and the simple, profound understanding that sometimes all people need is to be truly heard. The world still had its challenges, but for today, Sarah felt a little lighter, a little more seen.